Hello and welcome back to the IBS Freedom Podcast. In today's episode and every episode, I pray for the rest of our days, I am joined by Amy Hollenkamp, RD to the max.
Hello, everybody. Woo!
And
look at that excitement
we are talking
that I just brought.
Yes, you done good, my dear. You done good. I'm so proud. Now that you are the official hype person for the episode, would you like to reveal the topic of the day? This one, it doesn't feel like we're going to have cool science. It feels like this is just going to be more of a theoretical conversation, but I promise you there's actually some pretty solid science behind what we're going to talk about today. You want to start us off?
Yeah, so I'm super pumped. We're going to be talking about relationships, kind of social connection, and how it can impact your health. And again,
important.
It's so important. And I do think you're right. Sometimes there's a bit of an eye roll or I have bigger fish to fry than
Talk
my
about
relationship.
Talk about candida.
Right. But it's just such a fundamental aspect of our function in general, and it impacts our physical health in so many different ways. And again, it could be a big piece to the puzzle. I know we've talked about before where we'll be working with someone, or I know I've worked with a few people where I'm like, I think theoretically we should be seeing more progress. And then all of a sudden, there'll be a bomb that's dropped. And I don't think they sort of view it as a bomb, but they'll make some comment like, oh, my relationship with my husband isn't great, or some little comment that basically alludes to having some stress from relationships in their life, or sort of a consistent stress from either, again, a spouse or a loved one or a parent that really affects them a lot. And again, if that's happening in the background all the time, it's definitely going to affect your physiology, and it can affect your ability to progress with something like IBS.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, this is a topic, and this is a thing. I find that people are willing to work on literally everything else.
Yeah.
And this is the absolute last ditch. Do I really have to do it? Please don't make me do it kind of a thing. Right? Like, it's so much easier to take a pill or an herb or a tea or a tincture. It's easier to change your diet. I mean, I've worked with people who have whittled their diet down to quite literally nothing, like 3 foods, but they're not addressing the elephant in the room, which is that they're in a miserable relationship with their spouse.
Yeah.
Or, another element that I've seen too is when the spouse or whoever typically it's who you're living with, if they're not supportive of your healing journey. So I remember this one lady, I was working with her and her kid at the time. Side note, I no longer work with children, so don't get excited hearing me say this. But at the time, I was working with her teenage son and her, and the kiddo had ADHD and really enlarged tonsils. And they wanted to avoid a tonsillectomy, and we were hoping to support his body and support his immune system so they could avoid getting the tonsils taken out. And we did a little bit of testing and just some clinical experience kind of stuff. And I said, it looks like he's really sensitive to gluten and dairy, I think if I remember correctly, or gluten and eggs, one or the other. And we actually did IgE food allergy testing with LabCorp, and they came back positive. So I said, let's have him go gluten, dairy, and egg free, even for a month, to kind of get a sense for how that affects him. And then we could trial each of the foods individually. And I kid you not, there were so many appointments. They would come back and I'd be like, okay, how's he feeling? How is he doing? How's that gluten-free, dairy-free, egg-free thing going? Have you made any progress with that? And the mom always started off saying, yeah, we've been gluten-free since we talked to you last time. ... And that either immediately after that or a little bit later in the conversation, she would say, oh, well, he did have a hot dog bun. Oh, and he did have ice cream. Oh, and he did have cookies or cake or whatever it might have been. And I'm like,
right.
So he wasn't gluten-free or dairy-free or whatever it was. And almost every single time, I started noticing a pattern. It was the husband. The husband was very clearly not on board. And later on, it came out that he even like would say things like, this is making his life harder to change the kid's diet or for her to change her own diet. And it became abundantly apparent that, oh, you're not going to be able to change anything because not only is he not supportive of your efforts, but also it kind of felt like he was intentionally sabotaging it. And it almost felt like a fuck you, like I'm going to give the kid a hot dog bun, see if you do anything about it kind of a thing. And it was really, really frustrating for me because like I thought, oh, I have answers that could really help this kid potentially. So it was frustrating like for me as a clinician, but also like as a patient or as the parent of this kid, it was really frustrating for her, I think. But I think also this particular woman was not, again, it was like this huge elephant in the room, and she never really acknowledged that that was a problem. It would just come up like matter-of-factly, like, oh, he had a hot dog bun. But I don't think she put two and two together that like your husband is sabotaging your efforts to help you and your kid feel better. And she had like 5 autoimmune diseases. She had a lot of stuff going on. But I think that that's an element too, is like, there's this element of, oh, who is it? There's some guy, famous quote, and it's like, you are the accumulation of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Have you heard that quote or something to that effect, right? So it's like, you pick up on the habits and behaviors and the mannerisms and the speech patterns and the, you start picking up on the things from the people around you. So there's just that sort of subtle, barely noticeable sort of stuff that builds your behavior and your personality and your patterns and habits. But then there's also blatant sabotage sometimes, or just maybe not intentional, but unintentional sabotage coming from a spouse or a loved one. And it can be really, really difficult to overcome that, to a point where I can't think of a single case where I saw somebody with an unsupportive spouse to that degree, and they were able to overcome that. I think it's bitten people in the butt and kept them stuck every single time I've seen it. Yeah.
It's a really interesting observation. One thing I've noticed too is that, so I have a little part of my intake questionnaire that says how well supported, or how would you rate your support system or whatever. And there's one that's like, oh, I'm very supported. And then there's one that's like, oh, I'm somewhat supported, but I wish they would be more supportive. And then there's one that's like, I'm not supported at all. I think there's been only one time where someone said not supportive at all. But I always just assume if there's, oh, they're somewhat supportive, but that it could be a bigger issue that we might need to dig into a little bit more. But yeah, it's always an interesting observation. I rarely see people outright saying, I'm getting zero support or like no support, even though there might be a bigger lack of support. Like the level of awareness around it might not be something that's on everyone's radar, or being able to see it clearly of like, oh no, this isn't overly supportive. Yeah, I think you're right. There's the element of how much support are you getting in your journey with IBS or gut related issues. And then again, there's the whole, how is your overall relationship? Both are going to be important for progress. And again, I 100% concur with you. If there is family members or members of your support system that are not on board with what you're doing and aren't trying to help you to some degree, any degree that they can, then it's problematic. Or even creating barriers for you. That's definitely very problematic. But hopefully, and I would say, I know we've talked about it before. I do think that making it clear how someone can support you is important too. And, telling someone directly of here's what I need help with. Is it to make meals? Is it just to generally support you and allow you to vent if you're struggling? What emotional or physical support do you need, and how can you make that clear to someone else? I also think it's very important when you're talking about the context of your journey with IBS. I wasn't very good at that. So sometimes I was like, oh, I'm not getting as much support as I would like. But I also don't think I really verbalized and communicated what I needed very well.
Yeah, and the people around you aren't mind readers.
Right.
So, they can only do so much if you don't tell them what you need. And it's not to say, I don't want to paint this picture that everybody needs to be like bending over backwards to help you in your journey. I think if you think of it as a scale of like 0 to 10, 0 meaning, no, actually, I take this back. It's going to be, you'll see why. A scale of -5 to +5. 0 is neutral. They're not helping you, but they're also not being an asshole, and they're not like screwing things up either. So you've got neutral, and then like +5 on this scale would be like, oh man, my spouse has like read every book on this diet, and they're searching for new recipes, and they're trying to help me out, and they point out this and that, and like they'll come hold my hair when I'm puking, or I don't know, whatever it might be. And they're
come to appointments. Sometimes I'll see some spouses at appointments, and they're like taking notes and
Yes. And that's wonderful, but you're also not completely hosed if you don't have that in your life. I think as long as you don't start dipping into the negative numbers, like again, I think that this particular spouse was like, whether it was intentional or not intentional, that I cannot tell you, but he was on some level sabotaging what this woman was trying to do for her kid and herself. And it's like, it gets really hard to overcome this when you start dipping into those negative numbers.
Right.
Again, to a point where I don't think I've seen that yet in my clinical career. I think every time that this has come up, and I've kind of gotten a sense of like, ooh, your relationships are going to hold you back. I think that it has held them back every time that I can think of.
Right.
Now, can I pause us here for just a minute?
Yeah.
To share a little bit of nerdy science, because I know we're like, 13 or so minutes into the episode, and people are like, okay, this is cool, man, but like, why should I care? First of all, we probably lost those people already, and they already signed off. But if you want some of the context of like why this matters for people with IBS and SIBO and candida and leaky gut and that sort of stuff, go check out our gut-brain axis and vagus nerve episodes that were fairly recent, I think maybe 10 episodes ago, because those will paint more of a picture of like why social connectedness matters, why having a support system matters. And a lot of it falls back to the idea of having good vagal tone. And then the vagal tone, which you ultimately get from social interactions and having a support system, good vagal tone will lead to better enzyme and HCl and bile output and less inflammation in the gut and like better motility, better digestion. So a lot of it kind of traces back to the vagus nerve. But that being said, a little bit of science in regards to this, what we're talking about right now, there was, I just have a couple that I wanted to share. So there's a study, Social Relationships and Mortality Risk, a meta-analytic review. And this was pretty wild. They looked at data from just over 300,000 individuals, which is a pretty big data set. They followed them for 7.5 years, and they said that their results indicate that individuals with adequate social relationships have a 50% greater likelihood of survival compared to those with poor or insufficient social relationships. And they said the magnitude of this effect is comparable with that of quitting smoking, and it exceeds many well-known risk factors for mortality, such as whether or not you're obese and whether or not you do any physical exercise. So as much as I want people to prioritize quitting smoking and having a healthy weight and moving their body, this is actually just as strong of an indicator of survival or mortality rate. They also said that the association was strongest for complex measures of social integration and lowest for binary indicators of residential status. So if you're listening to this and thinking, oh my God, I'm doomed because I live alone, what am I going to do? Their data was weakest for that metric of like whether you live alone or with somebody else. But you're probably better off if you're a person who lives alone but has a lot of friends or relatives and you like hang out with people and you have good relationships in your life versus somebody who lives alone and never interacts with other people. Or conversely, if you were a person who lived with somebody else, maybe your spouse or your children or a roommate, and you hardly interacted with anybody and you didn't have a lot of friends or relatives or coworkers that you could talk to and interact with, you're probably worse off than the person who lives alone, but they have rich social connections.
Right. There's nuance to this conversation around some of these things. It reminds me so much of my grandmother. We might have talked about her before.
Fancy Nancy?
Fancy Nancy. She was such a peach, but she, I swear, had more birthday parties for herself to go to with friends at 85 than I ever did. She'd have like 6 birthday parties with different friend groups. And she was so well connected. And it was insane, like to the point where, so I went to a small school called Denison for my freshman year to play basketball. Interestingly enough, you know who also went to Denison? Steve Carell, Jennifer Garner. So some famous alumni. I only went there for a year because I got hurt and couldn't really play basketball anymore. But anyway, my grandma went to Denison for like 2 years during the war. And then I think it was kind of expensive, so she transferred to University of Dayton. But like she still kept in touch with the people from Denison that she went there for 2 years, and she would go to like alumni dinners and stuff. And I'm like, well, you're not an alumni. And then I got some alumni scholarship too. It was so bizarre. It was the weirdest thing. But I'm like, she was so well connected that somehow she kept in contact with people at Denison to where she was then labeled an alumni, even though she didn't graduate from Denison. So
she weaseled her way in.
Right. So it's just, it cracks me up. But she was always doing something. She was always out and about. She sang in the choir at her church because my grandfather died at 58 and she lived till she was 92 or 93. But her diet was horrible. It was like Diet Coke and pretzels. And, it's like, how do you survive on Diet Coke and pretzels for however many years? It's like, well, she had so much social connection and joy, and she loved throwing parties and organizing centerpieces and that kind of stuff. She just loved being social. She was a secretary at a law firm. So that's also like, if you can imagine probably how social and like personable you have to be at like a really reputable law firm in Cincinnati to be the secretary. So yeah, she was the bomb.com, but just the perfect example of missing the mark on nutrition and maybe even sleep. Like her and my grandfather did not sleep very well, like their whole life. They were notoriously up at like 2 a.m. all the time. And
Nancy.
It's like, yeah, so she was just a party animal. She partied her way to living a long life, essentially, is what I'm saying. Because yeah, she lived a very long health span too. I would say probably not until her late 80s did she really start experiencing a slowdown. She was traveling to other countries at 85. She was wild, but again, did not really prioritize health too much.
If she was eating Diet Coke and pretzels, I would argue she didn't prioritize health much at all.
Right. She never worked out or like
yet.
Again, she was on healthy. The go. Right. Again, I think her partying nature, her social nature really took her a very long way. So it's fascinating. I think cases like that are so interesting because you have, it's a good lesson because even sometimes I'm like, oh, I need to like really make sure I'm doing this one little tweaky thing. And it's like, oh, like I might need to step back and look at the bigger picture. Like, do I need to connect more? Or, you know,
Yeah.
am I putting too much emphasis on some of these other things and then it's hurting connection?
Well, and we see that pretty much across the board with the people we work with, right? Like
Right.
they pour so much energy and time and like stress, bandwidth kind of energy into their diet or taking their supplements or prioritizing like going to appointments or doing whatever for their health. And they don't, I think some people realize maybe because of our podcast that that's taking away from other aspects of their life. And some people, they don't even really fully realize, oh, I'm not living my life anymore. Holy shit. And it's like, we
Yeah.
have to point that out to them sometimes.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty wild stuff. And I love examples like this. I was just talking to somebody, and this might actually segue into a point that would be useful for this conversation too. So a patient and I were talking about like food fear and nutritional beliefs. And we've talked about like health anxiety, health OCD kind of stuff with her. And she has a lot of beliefs about food and a lot of like, this is good, this is bad, this is healthy, this is not kind of stuff. And interestingly, sounds like she picked up quite a lot from her parents, particularly her mom, who's an MD. And, you know, here this woman was almost definitely just trying to keep her family healthy, but didn't realize that she instilled a lot of like disordered eating and food fear kind of stuff into her kids. And, you know, still to this day, it sounds like that's an active kind of issue. We were talking about seeing her for the holidays and how that's going to affect this patient of mine. But we were talking about, okay, there's, you know, a belief, for example, that saturated fat might be unhealthy or meat is unhealthy or that carbs are bad or sugar is bad. And like, how do you kind of work around those beliefs so that you can have a diverse diet and really enjoy your food again? And I think one technique that I picked up from coaching groups over the years is that if you look at a belief that you hold, try to find an exception, right? Like, okay, you believe that meat is bad. Can you find even one single human being on planet Earth who eats meat and is still really, really healthy? Yes. If you believe carbs are bad, can you find even one human being on planet Earth who eats a whole ton of carbs and is still really healthy? The answer, by the way, is yes. Just go to Japan, go to like a lot of cultures outside of the United States still eat quite a lot of carbs and they're perfectly fine. But,
Right.
you know, it's like if you can find even one exception to a rule, it's not really a hard rule then. And I feel like
Right.
Fancy Nancy exemplified that. Like here, a lot of our people firmly believe that they have to have like the perfect diet and this dialed in nutrition plan in order to be healthy. But here's Fancy Nancy sustaining herself on Diet Coke and pretzels
and
crackers and
hard
absolute-
candy.
Yeah, shit food.
Right.
And she's gallivanting around the world up until she's 85 and having like a rich social life and just living her best life, quite literally. So Fancy Nancy here to teach us all a lesson, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. And again, I think we've talked about this before where our clients think that they have to get so dialed in so that they can connect socially. And that's sort of a bit of a backwards way to go about it too, because again, in order to progress, I think IBS wise, you have to be plugged in, you have to be engaged, you have to be connected. And so it shouldn't be this, oh, I will connect when I feel better. I don't have to worry about having diarrhea when I'm out and about or when I'm not having symptoms. It's you have to bring those things with you. And maybe again, it's annoying and not necessarily the most optimal situation, but it's still so important to connect and be social.
It is. And by the way, for those of you on video, I'm not trying to be rude, but I'm trying to find, there's actually an Instagram post that I saw really recently that I think will tie in with this conversation. I'm just trying to find it real quick so I could read it and cite it.
I have a study too. This one was a Harvard study. And they followed, I'm going to try to pull it up. I had a little, so it was 724 participants. So not nearly as big as yours, but they followed these people for 85 years. So it was a really long study.
Wow.
And basically what they found, they were trying to decide like what contributes most to a happy life, like that question. And again, like what helps with longevity too. They were kind of tied together, but basically social connection was the thing that came up as being like the number one factor in a happy long life is social connection. They label it, which is I think an interesting way to look at it. One of the articles, it wasn't the actual paper, but it was like a news article covering the study, called it social fitness, which I really like that term.
I like that.
You know, like how fit are your relationships to some degree? Like are there any gaps that you're missing? And they did provide, I'll have to see if I can link to it, but the one article that I read did provide like a little table, and it basically it's something you can fill out where you write out your relationship. So who's the relationship you're talking about? And then it goes through the different factors. So like safety and security, learning and growth, emotional closeness and confiding, shared experiences, romantic intimacy. Like it says help, practical and physical, fun and relaxation. And it talks about each of those categories and like what that means. So like safety and security would be who would you call if you woke up scared? Learning and growth, who encourages you to try new things? Emotional closeness and confiding, who knows everything about you? Who can you call if you're feeling low? Identity, affirmation, and shared experience. Is there someone in your life who has shared many experiences with you and who helps you strengthen your sense of self? Romantic intimacy. Do you feel satisfied with the amount of romantic intimacy in your life? Help, the help category. Who do you turn to if you need some expertise or help solving a practical problem? Like they give examples of like planting a tree or fixing your Wi-Fi. And then fun and relaxation. Who makes you laugh? Who do you call to see a movie or go on a road trip with? Or who makes you feel connected and at ease? And they call those the 7 keystones of support. Which it's kind of interesting to think about, you know, who would fall into each of those categories for you? Like, is there any gaps? Yeah. Or again, would you like to work on any of those categories with someone that you're close to? Might be a good tool to potentially assess your relationships and if there are any gaps in some of your social fitness.
I like that. Will you send me a link to that when we're done
I will.
Recording
and
later today?
I can put it, maybe you can put it in a link in the description.
Or did you say it was a research article? Can you just rip off the PubMed ID real quick?
So I'm having trouble. All the it is an article written about the research.
Okay.
So, but the research article, I keep clicking on links and it sends me to more articles. So I'm trying to.
It's one of those.
But I'll find the actual article too.
Yeah,
it's a Harvard study. I know. So it keeps linking me to like Harvard Gazette, and so it's like, okay.
Yeah, I think that I just like to check that out, and B, I have a whole section in FODMAP Freedom where we talk about relationships and kind of evaluating this and looking for holes, and I actually might include that tool in there.
Yeah.
One of the ways that I've conceptualized this too, and I'm gonna date myself, maybe even to you, youngin.
Uh-oh.
You hear me now? Old lady of the internet coming at you. Okay, I'm reluctant to even say these words. Did you ever have a MySpace profile?
MySpace was definitely still a thing when I was growing up, but I was really late to, like, I never did AIM, but like that was a big thing with my friends.
How are we friends?
I don't know. My friends did. I was a very late adopter of Facebook too.
Okay. Well,
I only did Facebook in college, where some people did it in high school.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I had a MySpace profile back in the day. Back when Facebook was only for like university.edu email addresses. And a lot of people couldn't get on Facebook. My best friend from high school went to a community college and they weren't on Facebook yet. So she couldn't join Facebook. So she basically mandated that I spend more time on MySpace so that I could interact with her, which is so funny. But MySpace had a thing called the Top 8. And
Okay,
you literally, like, this was a source of drama. You would put your top 8 friends in the top 8, and they would be like proudly displayed on your profile as your top 8. And if somebody removed you or added you to the top 8, it was like this big update in your world. So I kind of pose that you could think of it like your top 8, or again, I think it's like Jim Rohn or whoever it is that says the 5 people that you're spending the most time with. You could look at your top 8 or your top 5 and just kind of mentally think about your relationship with that person. Again, are they fun? Do you feel safe? Do they seem like they support you? Do they give a shit about you? Do you give a shit about them? Like, kind of run through some of these metrics and think, and also like, do they have any bad habits that rub off on you or vice versa? So one really classic example, if you want to lose weight, but all of your friends spend, like, if any of the social engagements that you get invited to with your friend group are like going to the Cheesecake Factory and eating a giant bowl of like fettuccine Alfredo and then cheesecake and white wine, like that's going to make it really freaking hard for you to not only lose weight, but also maintain that weight, right? Even if you refrain from those Cheesecake Factory or whatever dates with your girlfriends for a few months and you drop the weight, you go back into that life and you go back into that like habit and behavior.
Right.
And boom, you regress. So another example is if you're trying to quit smoking, but you live with somebody who smokes, good luck. So even things like that, like if there's things that like that are going to chip away at you and give you the illusion that you don't have discipline, when in actuality, it's just that's a really hard thing to try to change a habit and then be constantly exposed to that.
Right.
Like that's another consideration. But yeah, I like the quiz or the different categories that you listed.
Yeah. Yeah. I think sometimes I always think of with habits too, when you get pregnant and if someone's if the person who gets pregnant is more of a drinker, how sometimes they get so upset when the other partner is drinking.
Yeah.
It's like, why? I think it's sometimes similar to that. Or again, the same scenario if someone was trying to stop drinking, if it was a really bad habit and their spouse or significant other drank all the time. It's like, well,
the first year or two that I went gluten-free, it was hard to be around like good gluten product. Now, this was back in the day when we didn't have a lot of options for gluten-free bread or gluten-free bagels or whatever.
Right.
So the gluten-free bread that did exist kind of sucked and it was cardboard. And gluten-free pizza crust was not really a thing. Most restaurants didn't have an option for that. So you had to make it at home and then it totally sucked. And I was gluten and dairy-free and there wasn't really a lot of dairy-free cheese option available either. And I remember in particular, the first couple of years I was gluten and dairy free, I could not be around real pizza. It was really, really hard because it smelled amazing. And like I had to watch the people eat it. So I would make a point to not go to like campus functions that served pizza or, I wouldn't have been able to like go pick up the pizza for a party and then come home and not eat the pizza.
Right.
Like that sounded like torture. Versus now, it's funny, this came up in our real life recently. We were talking about, I forget if we were going to go to Wegmans or Costco, but Jess wanted a slice of pizza. And I was like, well, I could sit with her while she has a slice of pizza and then you go do your grocery shopping. And my husband was like, are you sure? Like you told me before that it would be really hard for you to be around real pizza. And I was like, well, like 13, 14 years ago. Yeah.
Right.
But now you could get gluten-free crust at virtually every pizza place.
Right.
Not all of them I trust, mind you, but theoretically. And like they have good options now and I could eat actual normal cheese
Right.
again. So if I have a gluten-free crust, at least I have the real cheese. So it
Right.
still feels like a real pizza again. And like now I have a viable enough replacement that I'm satisfied with that now I could be around real pizza. And also it's been, well over a decade that I've been gluten-free. Like this isn't my first rodeo anymore.
Right. Right.
But yeah, that's a consideration too. And again, like kind of going back to that initial story I shared with the wife who was trying to make changes and her husband was making it difficult for her to do that. There's a whole nother layer of complexity, even beyond the people and their patterns and behaviors and habits. Oh, by the way, I'm holding something in my hand and I'm playing with it as like a fidget toy, and I feel the need to point it out to our viewers. And Amy, you know what this is now. I found poop emoji erasers, and of course, I mailed some to Amy, and a toilet with a real lid that opens, and the little poops fit inside, and the toilet is an eraser. So these little poops are like the perfect little fidget toy when we're recording and I want something to do with my hands. So anyway, if you see me like holding my hand in a really awkward way, that's why.
You're holding poop.
I'm holding poop. Yes.
Can I tell you though something?
Yes.
Like a week ago, I had cleaned, or I just finished changing Cece's diaper, and I legit saw her like with a little, because she was a little constipated. So like, I don't know if like a little poop ball like fell out of the diaper when I threw it away, but all of a sudden I see her being like, and it's just a piece of a little turd in between her fingers. She's rolling it like a marble. I'm like, good Lord. And then I was cracking up because I went and we washed her hands and like we got rid of the little turdy. And of course, like I went to get her a towel and she immediately ran to the toilet and stuck her hand in the toilet. And I was like, so then I had to wash her hands again. It was just a whole thing.
A whole thing. Well, it makes me think of when you use the little like baby fart straw thing and a little bit of poop came out and Armand puked.
Yeah.
I'm sure he would have loved that. Her like casually rolling a little turd in her hand too.
Right,
that was almost right up there with the poop straw.
Yeah.
Lord knows what episode we talked about that in, but I'm sure we have talked about that on the podcast at some point.
Yeah, every time I go to baby showers now, most people get the poop straw. I was like, oh, there she blows.
Yeah.
Yeah, we only used it a few times. But yeah, it was kind of amazing. It would like literally whistle and then like poop would fly out. It was crazy. Well,
and to catch up any new listeners, by the way, so the idea was that the babies can't always like control and coordinate their sphincters and they get gassy and they have to fart, but like they can't fart. So the idea is that you get this little straw and you put it in their little butthole and then it's like, like it releases the gas, which is great, but also sometimes a little bit of poop comes out. That's kind of what you're gambling with when you put a straw in that hole.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, poop straw. Now I've completely lost sight of what I was going to say, but I have something to share anyway. So more nerdy research that I found that I wanted to share. So I joked earlier in the episode that on some level, a lot of people right now are like, just talk about leaky gut, lady. Just talk about Candida. That's what I actually care about. So here's this as a neat thing. Here's a study titled Marital Distress, Depression, and the Leaky Gut, Translocation of Bacterial Endotoxin as a Pathway to Inflammation. The PubMed ID, if you want to read this yourself, is 300-98513. And they said, participants with more hostile marriage interactions had higher LBP, which is a marker for leaky gut, than those who were less hostile. Additionally, the combination of more hostile marital interactions with a mood disorder history was associated with higher LBP to CD14 ratio. And they basically said that these things were also associated with higher C-reactive protein production. So you get more inflammation and more leaky gut, and it was correlated with marriages that had more hostile marital interactions. There was another kind of similar study, or similar idea. It was different one. I'm not going to I'm looking at a PowerPoint slide, so I can't see the title right now, but the PubMed ID is 371-07717. And they observed that you share a lot of your gut microbiota pattern with your spouse.
Yeah.
Maybe because you're eating similar things, maybe because you're swapping spit. I don't know. But they said, in addition, individuals with better relationship quality, parentheses, greater relationship satisfaction and intimacy and less avoidant communication, and parentheses, had greater microbial diversity, a sign of healthier gut microbiota. So I know that everybody just wants to talk about leaky gut and dysbiosis and inflammation and like, how much turmeric do I need to take to get the inflammation
Right.
down? But the answer might not be turmeric. The answer might be that you need to go to marriage counseling. Or, I mean, I'm sure there's at least one listener right now that's listening, and the ultimate answer for their IBS is that they need to get a divorce and be separated from the person that they're with
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
And, you know, I know that that's a huge deal. I don't say that flippantly, but,
Yeah.
you know, statistically, how many listeners we have, I guarantee there's at least one person out there right now. The answer for them is a divorce.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. And it's, again, like probably the hardest thing to do. That's why it's avoided so much. It's like,
Well,
okay.
yeah, it's easier to take the turmeric or the glutamine or the probiotic or do the
Right.
low FODMAP diet or whatever and like, oh, it's histamine. Histamine's bad. No, man, maybe your mast cells are freaking out trying to protect you because you're always in fight or flight mode and you can never get into rest and digest mode. And that's why you're stuck.
Right. Yeah. I
I
wholeheartedly agree.
What I've come to realize is I don't think IBS or even SIBO are intrinsically difficult to treat. What I would say is that sometimes the treatments are difficult to implement,
I wholeheartedly agree.
right? Like,
And again,
again,
you can get
relationships.
lost. Like, again, we don't want you to get lost in the shuffle of the probiotics and some of these other interventions if there is a big deal breaker that you're either kind of ignoring, and maybe you have to ignore it for a period of time. Maybe it's not the best time to divorce at this exact moment, but you have to understand that some of the interventions you are doing could be band-aids and might help you get through a period whatever period you have to get to until you can actually pull the trigger on a divorce. But
Or-
yeah, or do couples counseling or whatever it is, like whatever the big step is for getting the relationship back on track, or again, ending the relationship.
Or maybe there's a work relationship, maybe like finding a new job or doing things with your work. Like that's a whole nother piece of the relationship puzzle too.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I had a client one time who she had a really troubling experience at work. And I think she went to HR about it. But then everyone in the company sort of knew. And so it created all this drama and a lot of like animosity or resentment or just a weird experience for her at work then. And it made her feel very insecure, very fight or flighty at work all day. And you're at work for, 8-9 hours of your day. And so again, if you're in fight or flight for 8 or 9 hours of every day because you had a terrible experience at work and you have bad relationships with your higher ups, that's going to be problematic. And I agree. It's not always, you can't always be like, I'm going to quit my job right here, right now. And that was the scenario for this girl. But you can at least put some irons in the fire and start to, what's the next baby step that you can do? And maybe, like I said, you can do some band-aidy things that will still help your gut and support your gut, but it's not necessarily going to address all the root causes if this is still on the table. This fight or flight at work scenario is still present.
Yeah, again, if there's an elephant in the room, you're only going to get so far putting in new carpet.
Yeah.
Right? Like sometimes you just have to remove the elephant that's pooping on your carpet.
Yeah.
But I will say this too. There's also this, this additional complication, this additional layer of, we also don't want all of our listeners to go and quit their job and get a divorce and uproot their entire life. Because here's the thing too, it almost always takes two to tango.
Right.
So there might be some like deeper inner work that you want to address and like your side of the equation, in addition to dealing with the toxic or heavy or not favorable relationships or the stress or the whatever. And I'll use two examples. So I know a family member, and he's been through several different jobs with various companies. And what I've noticed is, initially with a new job, it's like, this is the best place ever. They're great. They're doing everything right. All the people are great. The company's great. Everything's great. This is the best ever. Oh my God, yay.
Right.
And then gradually over a couple years, that fizzles. And then another few years, and everybody's evil. The company is crumbling. I need to jump off this sinking ship. This is a shithole. I can't believe I ever worked here. Oh my God, this is terrible. And then they jump ship to another job or another company and be like, oh, thank God I left that hellhole. I can't believe how awful that was. And those people sucked and they didn't get it. And then they'd go through the same thing again. It was like, these people are great. They really get it. This is amazing. This is the best institution in the world. Oh my God. And it would repeat. And it's like, at some point, you have to notice the pattern. And another one very similar that kind of cracks me up. So a relative of mine, for many decades, she was in a similar pattern, but with her living situation. So she and her husband would move, and, oh, this is a great town. It's a great house. The farm that we moved to is wonderful. This is the most beautiful, perfect place to live ever. Hooray for us. Yay. And then gradually that would fade. And then eventually the town sucks. There's nothing here. The people are evil. The neighbors are horrible. The barn is falling apart. Like, everything about here is terrible and rotten and awful. And then they would move. And again, the cycle would start over and over again. And the rest of the family would kind of observe, like, wow, do you think that they're ever going to get the idea that they are the constant variable? In the 10 different towns that they've moved to, they are the one and only variable that remains constant. And it's always the same pattern. So definitely like take ownership of your shit and your part in these relationships and your work and your performance at work. Like, don't think that just cutting all ties and starting anew is always going to be the cure. But there is this element of like, if there's something, again, a big elephant in the room, and if there's a relationship or a person who's really just sucking the life out of you, especially if you live with the person, if you have something that big, that's that big of a hurdle at home, you're really going to be hard pressed to heal until you improve that relationship or just cut ties with it entirely.
Right. I think you're totally right. And that might make it so hard to change, is it's on you and the other person. And there has to, one, be self-awareness on your end and a desire to potentially compromise or meet in the middle or work on your issues. And then at the same time, you have to have that from your spouse or your roommate or whoever it is that you're living with. They have to have mutual respect and a willingness to change and a willingness to be self-aware too. And I think that those are the keys to success when it comes to repairing relationships and building a stronger relationship. I think that for individuals where, it might need to end in separation or whatever it is, it's like when there's scenarios where these things have been tried, or like, you've run through this where like you have worked on yourself, or they've tried to work on things and just, it's never really, you haven't been able to get over the hump. But I totally agree with you. There has to be some ability to assess your own strengths and weaknesses in a relationship. And, you can give yourself some self-compassion and try to understand maybe why, approach it with curiosity, understand why you might react the way you do to certain situations, or, hear the other person out as to what is bothering them and try to create some constructive steps forward. But yeah, I agree. I don't think I've ever seen a scenario, and I'm sure there are a few cases where it really is like all one person. But I would say 95% of the time, it's, a
Takes two to
percentage
tango.
of each person's issue, and you're on the same team. And as long as you kind of can feel that the person still sees you as being on the same team and you can sort of build from there, I think that's when you can really work and salvage and repair relationships. But I think, again, like
Yeah.
if there is like, if it's just totally disconnected and there's no hope for salvaging it, that's a different scenario. But yeah, I agree. Like, you should definitely try to make things work and build relationships. But yeah, at some point there is a line where it's like, this isn't what anyone wanted, but it might be the thing that's going to lead to the most happiness long term for each person.
Well, and again, I don't say this lightly, but I think this has come up in my life before, and I go back to this saying. So have you heard the expression, people come into your life for a reason, a season, or a lifetime?
Yeah.
Honestly, there are, sorry, I touched the mic there. There are going to be people who just come into your life for a few months or a few years or maybe a decade, and then that season of your life has passed and you both need to move on for whatever reason. And it's not, you could look at it this way too, that if you let go of one thing, you might be making room for something else, something even better, or something that's more suited to your life in this moment. And yeah, it's easier said than done, but I think that this is something that can really hold you back if you're not aware of it. And again, having some self-awareness and having awareness of them. And yet, like, this is where maybe couples counseling or something like that could be really helpful. I remember actually when I was in grad school, I think maybe Mike and I just gotten engaged. I forget. I remember that a girl that I was in school with, she was like a semester or two ahead of me in school. And I remember she was engaged. They were going to get married right after graduation. And she mentioned that she and her fiance were doing like marriage counseling. They weren't even married yet.
Yeah.
And I remember being like, that's weird. Why would you need to do that? But now, as an adult who has perspective, I could say that was freaking brilliant.
Yeah.
Because they kind of like, I don't know if grease the wheel is the proper expression for this, but like they got the first handful of appointments kind of out of the way when they didn't have any animosity towards each other. They were able to get a feel for like what marriage counseling is going to look like and what they can expect. And they developed a relationship with a professional that they know they can confide in and like knows them. And like this professional kind of knows them when they're at their best, so to speak, when they're not currently fighting. And then you get established, kind of like how you establish care with like a primary care doctor, and you do that before you ever get sick. So that when you go in when you're sick or symptomatic, they're more like prepared to help you.
Yeah.
But
they know the dynamic in your history much better
I think it's
than
so
just
brilliant.
jumping into like an insane conflict or something.
And that's how it usually goes with marriage counseling, right? Like it's probably 95% of the time or more, people only come not only after they've had a lot of difficulties and a lot of fighting, but also it's almost always one spouse dragging the other one, kicking and screaming. And then there's like the added stress of your spouse doesn't even want to be there and they think it's a waste of money or whatever. And you're helping to save the marriage and they're not. And it's, so that might be a takeaway.
It's really,
do marriage counseling before you think you need it.
It's interesting because Armand and I did that. And it was mainly at the advice of his dad, who, again, my husband's parents are divorced. So I think he's always like, let's be proactive about this. And I think it is really good. It's almost like, I think in the gut health space, sometimes we let things get to a point where it really, we've seen signs of issues brewing, but then we don't necessarily act until it becomes a much bigger problem. So it's almost a preventative strategy or like a preventative, proactive type strategy versus being on the defense. But, I think that couples counseling was really valuable for us just to understand like our conflict styles and, what we both need to work on. I tend to be from more of a family that shoved things under the rug, where he tended to be from a family where they would just like fight in front of the kids, which is like, and like bitter battles like back and forth. So like what he saw was totally opposite of what I saw, which was like no fighting, maybe like some slight comments here or there that you could tell. But so again, it affects our conflict styles, where sometimes I'm like, whatever, I'll shut down. Whereas he would tend to build up to a boiling point quicker than I would. So it's just good to kind of understand his history of how you might have developed different things and ways to help your communication styles mesh better, and different strategies that would help there. I did remember something, and I'm glad I did. So there is a group locally, a psychology group called Gallia Collaborative. I've done different various therapy stuff there. They have Thrive circles, which are great too for different conditions. So like infertility Thrive circle, they're kind of like support groups essentially. They had a young empowered women circle, which was you would come with a goal and they would support you in the goal over like the 8-week or 12-week period. So they're fun ways to connect and be social. So they're a great group. But anyway, so the head of the group, her name's Ashley Solomon. She sends out a newsletter each week. And one of the newsletters was titled Freaks in the Sheets. And interestingly enough, she is more recently going through divorce and has actually started a new relationship with another man more recently. And so she was talking about how she wants to do things differently. But she was talking freaks in the sheets in terms of like an Excel sheet. So it was sort of a pun. But some of the stuff that she was talking about was really interesting. I'd like to just read some of these things because she gives some specific tips. So she says, treating a partnership like a company might sound like the unsexiest thing you've ever heard. But after years ago reading some guy named Patrick, talk about approaching your family like your most important organization, I thought it was an interesting concept. Now, like anything, this can go way too far. I'm not suggesting that partners need to give performance reviews, but I do believe that it makes a whole lot of sense to apply some of the organizational principles we know work. This isn't an exhaustive list, but just a starting point to consider if any of these lists or practices could help your partnership feel smoother, more equitable, more transparent, or just easier. So she says she does Sunday check-ins. Most of us agree that there's a ton of value to work to having regular touch bases with colleagues or manager where we can check in on important projects, offer feedback to one another, and understand priorities. Still, we tend to take that kind of communication for granted at home. Our Sunday check-ins, and there's nothing special about the day of the week, consists of 3 core things: reviewing the upcoming shared calendars, updating the budget, and going through seeing you questions. If we have time or need to, we check in on our fair play spreadsheet. I think she talks about some of these things, but basically she's checking in on Sunday. Fair play cards is the other thing she talks about. Fair play is a system that helps couples divide domestic responsibilities in ways that work for them. So she talks about some of the things that can help kind of divide the housework more evenly, which I know a lot of people struggle with. She talks about a budget. So she said there's a million different ways to approach it, but just having transparency is really important. And you could do an old-fashioned spreadsheet or customize it however you want, but just making sure you're on the same page from a financial situation. And then she talks about seeing you questions. And she said, this is simply the practice of asking each other questions that we are curious about, things that deepen our awareness of each other. It's easy at the start of a new relationship to be fascinated, but maintaining that curiosity and wonder with our partner takes intentionality. We each ask each other 2 questions and answer each other's and our own. And she shares some questions, some of these fair seeing you questions in a lot of her content. And then she talks about shared calendars. So they look at the calendars and make sure that they're spending enough time with each other and that they're on the same page so that they're not building resentment if they don't understand what's going on with each other's calendars. And then lastly, she talks about PTO. It says this is the concept that each person in the couple needs solid time to be off of their regular responsibilities and recharged. Treating this as PTO can make sure it happens. In couples, I've seen they've given each other 1 PTO night off per week or 1 full day of PTO per month and a weekend of PTO per year. Personally, I think a weekend per quarter sounds more reasonable, but the amount matters much less than the idea that we treat our partner's need for downtime as sacred. So like asking your partner to take some of your responsibilities, being a part of this. So this was a really interesting list in her newsletter. I wonder if you can access these, but yeah, so Sunday check-ins, kind of how to divide the domestic duties, the budget, seeing you questions where you're just building curiosity with your partner, sharing your calendars each Sunday, and then PTO. Like how can you take some of your partner's responsibilities at time to get more downtime to yourself. But yeah, I thought that was a really interesting email newsletter.
Yeah. Well, and that's a whole nother can of worms that we probably don't have time for today, but dividing up duties around the house.
Yeah.
I know one friend of mine in particular, that's a really big source of her marital stress is that I think that they both come from very like traditional households where it's assumed that the wife is going to take care of the children and cook and clean and maintain the household and like do the grocery shopping, and the husband's going to work. But the problem is my friend went to school with me and she's a chiropractor. So she went to grad school and got a license and has a very expensive degree that she would very much like to use, but she's not really able to practice as a chiropractor very much. And she has very limited hours because she has so much to do at home. And like, I think when she has approached this with her husband, it's like in one ear, out the other.
Right.
Because again, I think that he comes from a family and his world belief is that the woman should take care of all this stuff. And it's not to say that that's intrinsically a bad belief to have, but it doesn't mesh well with the fact that she has a career and a degree. And like, you know, it would be one thing if she hadn't gone to school and spent $250,000 on getting this license in hopes that she would be able to practice someday. But the reality is that she did go to school and she does have a degree and a skill and like a desire to practice. So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place where she wants to practice more. And if she did practice more, she could earn more money and that would take some financial stress off of them. But right now he's not willing to allocate resources towards childcare because they don't have a lot of money. Right. But she's like, but if we invest in childcare so I don't have to be home all the time, then I could earn more money. And then my hourly rate is high enough that it would make sense. But we have to do that initial investment. So anyway, it's very challenging to be in a situation like that. And I think my impression from this friend is that they got married and they started having kids and there wasn't really a lot of strategizing and like there was never a sit down discussion of how this was all going to play out. They all just kind of flew by the seat of their pants and built it as they went, and they didn't realize that they had 2 very different assumptions or beliefs about how this would work. And now they're kind of stuck and they're in a bit of a pickle trying to work this out.
Right. And trying to find like a middle ground option is challenging. I think that there is just inherently a little bit more of the domestic splitting. I think they call it invisible labor. Tends to fall more so on the woman in like a marriage. Not
There is
always. Again, I think there's nuance to this situation, and I think in some situations that might work well. But I also think if there's disagreements on that, it's not necessarily good for the relationship. If there's resentment building because you're not being appreciated for that time and energy, or if you want to do something else and your time's limited and you're stuck doing all the housework, all this, like that's not good. So I think that there has to be a mutual agreement on like domestic at-home tasks. And usually that involves splitting it to some degree. Now, I think within each marriage, it probably depends on a lot of different variables, who does what. But it's definitely something to work on and build cooperation on and an understanding with a spouse, I think. And just kind of acknowledging who's doing more of the invisible labor and are they being appreciated? Is that what the goal is? Is someone happy with that? Do they want to change? Is all something that I think is really important to hash out with a partner.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Like I said, that we're almost verging on a whole separate episode in a way, because I feel like we could probably speak to that.
I feel like too, we're also like the opposite of that, where I feel like both of our husbands are much more like doing more of the domestic-y.
Well, part of it is your husband's OCD and his desire to vacuum every single day of his life. So
that's true. That is true.
OCD can be helpful, people.
It can be, but
unless he's vacuuming during the recording of this podcast, which he has done before.
That is true.
And then we razz him for that.
True.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I want to make sure that we're wrapping up in a timely manner, not only for your purposes, because I know you've got some work that you need to do now, but also for our listeners. I really hope that this episode was helpful. Again, if you made it to the end of this conversation, more power to you. Right. I think we probably lost some people right at the beginning when we mentioned relationships, because they knew damn well there's an elephant in the room and they refused to look at it. And they were just like, nope, peace out, skipping this one.
Right.
So if you're here listening to me right now, more power to you. I appreciate that you listened to the whole thing. And we will come back at you with another episode next week, before you know it, right back here on the IBS Freedom Podcast. Until then, take care of yourself, be happy, healthy, and we will see you soon.